starting off a little bit about you, Margot, could you tell us a little bit about your own personal journey? I mentioned that you did a PhD and a master's in the field of climate change, but I know that before you studied classics at Cambridge. So could you a little bit expand on how your personal background and interests have geared towards the field of sustainability data and green finance over your life?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, I remember when I first started working in Switzerland during my master's and then my PhD in Geneva, and everyone I spoke to, either when I was working in Zug with Asset 4 or at the University of Bern in Geneva, they found it completely bizarre that I should have started off doing classics. It just wasn't in the syntax of what someone working in this field might be doing. And it may well have seemed an odd place to start, in terms of higher education. But perhaps I can start off by zeroing in on what it is that I do these days, and then how these dots make sense, even if that is hindsight. So in the last 10 years of my career, I've really been focusing on these issues around how do we get financial institutions and investment to better account for the risks and opportunities that nature and our natural assets provide. So we're talking about our soils, our forests, our mangroves, our coral reefs, our grasslands, and so forth. And with Asset 4, this is an ESG information provider that's now part of Thomson Reuters. This focused on the analysis of companies' non-financial performance. So basically, how do companies perform on indicators relating to the environment, their social performance, their governance performance, and really looking at these metrics to understand, how fit these companies are to a lot of factors that are less measurable than traditional fundamentals, but increasingly we know, just as important to sort of material, reputational, and regulatory or even financial risks that do affect the bottom line. Then at UNEP-FI, which is the UN partnership with the finance sector that includes about 200 banks, investors, and insurers, as well as in my consultancy work, this began to focus more on providing guidance around the sort of finance sector, to the finance sector around how to better incorporate a lot of the risks that we just heard about in the video, so water scarcity, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and so forth. How do you incorporate these into different areas of finance, from lending to mining companies, especially around water risk, to fixed income investors, thinking about how they're investing in sovereign bonds and country risk related to these things. And it was a super interesting time. It was just as the industry consciousness was really waking up, with a lot of really key and quite seminal studies of the finance and economic case for taking climate change, ecosystem health, biodiversity into account. Now at Earth Security, we really focus on developing the analytics, sort of activating the right organizations to mobilize private and public sector finance to invest in climate change or climate change adaptation in nature, helping investors, governments, companies understand, how they could work together to scale finance for nature. So maybe sort of to take it back, I was really lucky at Cambridge to have the great Mary Beard, who is my director of studies. I'm not sure if people are familiar with her, but she's now become quite a well-known author and presenter of TV programs and books on the ancient world. She wrote an amazing book called Women in Power a few years ago. But I think it was that experience, it was a sort of part of an English education that I think really instilled this sense of the importance of asking questions, of inquisitiveness, a perspective. There are always a number of different ways to look at a problem, and that you really can get quite creative in sort of addressing the challenges and problem solving from any sector that you end up in. And I think it really taught me to be a critical observer of issues and phenomena. And I think these are skills that have really helped me in my daily work, and critical skills to apply to any complex problem. I spent a lot of my childhood traveling the world. I was a diplomat's kid in schools, in American school in South Korea, local school in Jamaica, in Kingston. And I think these are really humbling experiences and instill a sense of inquisitiveness in you. and a realization very early on of the sort of complexity of our world and of the different impacts of development. And so I knew from an early age I had a real desire to work in development. I think before this idea of, you know, sustainability ever really existed for me in any real way. And you know, I was always interested in this, but I think the challenge of having done classics at an undergrad level and being interested sort of broadly in these issues related to development and conversation was that at the time around 2003, I just didn't understand what my roots were to working on these things. You know, at that point, pretty much all my peers, whether they'd done art history or engineering, were going into you know, further law degrees, we're going into banks, we're going into consultancies. And I definitely felt quite lost about those practical next steps I could take. And it was certainly something that, you know, careers advice didn't really accommodate what probably to them felt sort of like a sort of slight dreamer aspirations at the time. So I think just to wrap up my, you know, sort of this arc is that, you know, I took a couple of very practical steps, and I took a job where I thought I would learn some useful skills. Luckily for me, that was sort of within the finance sector. And then I sort of put an expiration date on how long I was going to do that until I sort of sorted out what I did really want to do. And so after 3 years, around 2005, 2006, it was just at this time when the focus on climate and energy had just exploded. And there was just this real sort of awakening. I think the, you know, I think third or fourth IPCC report was about to come out. And I spoke to a huge amount of people to work out what should be my next steps, and decided on a master's I felt would sort of put me in the best place, nudge me in the right direction. And it did, and it really opened up a whole new world for me for work that I do feel really passionate about, and I feel is sort of focusing on issues that I deeply care about. But it did require a lot of inquiry. It required a lot of work to identify the right programs, the right skills I would need for working on these issues, and then continued sort of networking to land those first few roles at a point where the industry was actually quite small. And I think just to, you know, just to finish on this note that, you know, the industry is really thriving now. And this is a really interesting time to, I think, be plotting your own path into how to work on these issues. You know, maybe thinking about who those right people are to talk to, what are those right sort of, you know, skills to be building. But I think it's a really good time to be looking at this industry.
Great, thank you so much for that, Margot. Actually, you went kind of perfectly into my second question. That was really about along similar lines about obviously you've talked to us a little bit about your own journey, but what advice would you kind of give to other people who are maybe looking to have a similar journey, or maybe a little bit different, but still in the areas of sustainable development? So what advice would you offer kind of to younger individuals, but to also the older generations?
Yeah, so look, I think it's really easy to be, or to, you know, to feel incredibly despondent right now. You know, at the moment about the potential job market, especially if you're under 25, I think I can resonate with that feeling, and I feel right now for younger people. But I think it's also really important to actually look at the current trends in this sector, in sustainability jobs, and how a number of industries are developing, and actually really get quite excited that there are many jobs that are becoming more aligned with sustainable outcomes, principles, and there's a lot of growth in demand for sustainability professionals. And just to prove that I'm not making this up, I actually looked up a few stats around this. And so in 2020, amidst the total, you know, economic doom of COVID-19, there was 7% growth in sustainability jobs globally. 12% in the UK, 13% in Europe, and in the UK, green job postings grew 32%. So look, I think, you know, that's a good signal that this is the right, and if you're making career choices right now, really look at jobs that are focused on sustainability, because it's a good industry and skill set to be moving into, let alone the fact that it's probably aligned more with your kind of core interests and principles. You know, when I speak to people in their 20s today, and I speak to quite a lot of young people who are really wanting to get into this field, I really stress that there are so many more possibilities and jobs at entry level as well as senior levels in every type of organization and sector as we see sustainability mainstreaming. So more companies are realizing the need to invest in sustainability programs and community-based activities. And I think what's quite interesting is that this is sort of the kind of work that would have been done in NGOs before. You probably wouldn't 10 years ago have found many of these jobs within a big multinational perhaps, or within a smaller organization. But now these roles are possible in local companies and in the big multinationals. And then for a lot of companies, sustainability itself is just becoming part of the business model, in terms of circular manufacturing processes or new services. We're not just talking about carbon trading and renewable energy finance, which was a lot of what was on offer even when I was coming out of my master's program in 2006. And in addition, I just read this great statistic from the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity that was released just this week. And the ILO have come up with a stat that nature-based climate solutions are estimated to have around 10 times the job creation rate of investment in fossil fuels. So I really think if we can start to shift to more nature-positive business approaches, that the outlook for jobs for the upcoming generation of workers could be just a lot more exciting, to be frank. And then, for people who are perhaps at a later point in their careers, certainly in the field that I work in, I see a real need for people who can understand, financial transactions and what it means to be able to put deals together. But instead of a fund that invests in carbon intensive production, we're talking about, funds emerging now that are focused on investing in carbon, in nature, in forests and water. These are just new realms that are opening up. And we need people who kind of understand these sort of different sides of the transaction, this conservation component and the financial component. And I think that's a really exciting place to be, and calls for people who have, one of these skills to just skill up on another level, and you're suddenly sort of really gold dust in this field. So the question is, I think, for people in their mid-careers is, how do you skill up for that? What projects can you try and convince your organizations to take on? Perhaps as an entrepreneur to gain those skills and that experience. But also there are just so many amazing kind of online materials now, whether it's executive MBAs or just, stuff that LinkedIn is providing that you can dip your toes in and to see how to really integrate sustainability into your products, into your industry. And then from there, I think it starts a new conversation with yourself, most importantly, but also with your organization that, are just more willing now to entertain the whole plethora of different sustainability actions as part of core business than they were perhaps even 5 years ago.
Great, thank you so much, Margot. I would definitely say, even relating this person to myself, my dream job would probably be working in nature-based solutions. So that's definitely something that I could echo. So talking a little bit more about Earth security. So I obviously only offered a brief overview kind of in my introduction. But for those who are not really familiar with the organization yet, could you tell us a bit more on what you think Earth security, what you think makes Earth security unique? And also climate change in Singapore as a case study of a green city, and talking about the recent M40 Cities Network, I think, report that you published, and if Singapore was part of this cities network.
Okay, great. So maybe just to answer, I'll get into Earth security, but I think maybe just to answer the question on Singapore, if they're still in Singapore and engaging the city in any way. Singapore was one of the cities we looked at, not as part of the M40, because they've actually cut down all their mangroves over the last few years, so there simply aren't any left. So I think if you're going to be focusing on Singapore as a green city, I think something Singapore could be doing a lot more of is looking at nature-based solutions. And I know this is something that's on their radar. One of the scientists whose research we used for our concept around financing mangroves at the city level was actually from the National University of Singapore. So I'd happily, make connections as well. But I'll come on to that after. Let me just give a bit of an introduction into what we do at Earth Security. So we started Earth Security about 10 years ago, really to focus on a set of key challenges relating to the complexity of sustainability issues and the silos with which organizations were really tackling these individual issues. So there was, 10 years ago, it probably seems strange to talk about now, but there was very much people looked at climate, or they looked at water, looked at energy, and they were really looking at these systems in like very distinguished and siloed approaches. And to an extent, this still exists in the world of development aid and finance. Very often you're really looking sort of down this sort of siloed lens. And we felt there was a real need to simplify the complexity of what are actually these converging sustainability pressures, from climate change to water security to economic inequality and gender issues, and, all the 169 targets of the 17 SDGs basically. So, this was in our approach to trying to simplify this complexity. We really did this through what at the time was quite a sort of innovative data analytical approach, creating a kind of a country sustainability risk visual, pressure visual, that could kind of sort of simplify all of this in a very concise and understandable and sort of visually attractive way. But then alongside that was really to then provide some very practicable strategic advisory to our clients, whether they were big global banks or governments, on how to align their investments with addressing those sustainability pressures. Which of all of these different issues, what is it that we need to focus on? How do you prioritize amidst all this complexity? And then what are the financing partnerships and solutions that you can take forward to sort of tackle a set of sustainability challenges in a specific market or region, and how to mobilize private finance to support investments in nature and climate adaptation. And so over this time, we really see sort of three key challenges that have emerged. First is this ongoing destruction of nature and the continued impacts of climate change. And again, just to sort of ground this in some sort of stats and facts, we know that investing in nature is absolutely key to our economic security and our climate security. More than $44 trillion of global economy is dependent on nature. At the same time, we know that protecting, restoring, managing natural landscapes and wetlands could deliver about a third of emissions reductions that we need over the next decade. So, nature is totally fundamental, not only to our economic security, but also to undo a lot of the damage that our global economy has done over the last 50 to 100 years in particular. And so moving to this idea of a regenerative economy, an economy that's nature positive and climate neutral, is just totally fundamental. And these sort of nature-based solutions is really a triple win for people, nature, and climate. We know, however, that these systems do not get a look in at the moment in terms of global finance. There's a $700 billion funding gap for the protection and restoration of nature on an annual basis. And then thirdly, if we're going to really see, if we're going to address this financing gap, we need to see just a massive step change in how projects that invest in the restoration and protection of nature are developed, in how they're financed, for us to get to the scale of restoration of our sort of global natural assets. Literally, they are a global asset. And, that's really needed. The step change is needed over the next decade. I think that's very much what, the TED countdown is all about. It's really pressing that point that we have a decade to make this change. And to do that, we just need to accelerate how we're financing this stuff very, very quickly. So Earth Security really works as a bridge, across all the really important actors that need to activate and scale up finance. for nature and climate, whether that's, it's the investors, it's the banks, it's the governments, it's the municipalities. Singapore, just to come back to that, is a city state, and it's conservation organizations. But we're also trying to simplify the complexity of these challenges for that audience, and propose quite practical financing pathways that these groups can then develop to scale finance at a global level, rather than just looking at sort of singular conservation projects. And I was going to talk about the work that we're doing in the Philippines, but I think just to maybe bring it back to this idea around the M40s, which I'll talk about in a bit further down the line, is that that's exactly what this concept. So last year we looked at developing the financing case for investing in mangroves as a nature-based solution, and what the concept of the M40s, the mangrove M40 cities network with a financing instrument that went with it, was really all about, was trying to move away from seeing mangroves, seeing these individual conservation projects that just really struggle to get access to finance, and being able to see, this band of mangroves that stretches across the tropical zone of our planet, as a global asset that needs to be invested in, and what are the mechanisms that you can develop to really generate global finance and global finance to help restore and protect this band of mangroves, this sort of green wall across the tropical zone that creates, an enormous amount of value for livelihoods, for protecting coastlines of cities from like Mumbai, Miami, Singapore, and so forth. But that also draws down carbon emissions incredibly powerfully as well. So that was sort of, that's sort of to put it into context. Maybe just to, very quickly elucidate some of this with the work that we're doing in the Philippines. So we've been working for 4 years in the Philippines with, sort of on behalf of the German International Climate Change Initiative, which, we've worked there with Filipino banks, companies, insurers, local governments, to see what are the financing partnerships and vehicles that could help increase private sector financing into nature-based solutions to climate change. So very specifically, we're working with insurance companies and the sort of insurance industry body to help develop the research and the models that are needed to integrate value and protection provided by coastal ecosystems, such as mangroves, into their underwriting process. For example, we're also helping them to establish the partnerships that are needed with conservation organizations to then, once they understand the protective value that's being provided, how do you then co-finance these projects that are restoring and protecting these ecosystems? We're also working with the leading business school in the Philippines, AIM, on an incubator program that brings mayors and some of the Philippines' biggest conglomerates and companies together to develop their own partnerships that could co-finance local investments in nature-based solutions that protect those towns and cities, on these incredibly vulnerable coastlines of the Philippines, but that also improve supply chain resilience for these countries and these companies, and operational resilience. And in the case of the Philippines, this has been incredibly important because it's been so badly hit by COVID. So these kinds of programs, are developing kind of new investment partnerships that are really important for sort of local green recovery as well, and this idea of, building back better as well.